Illinois faces some big challenges. Today, we're about to hear a truly honest analysis of the problems we face. Equally as important, you'll also hear an in-depth discussion of some practical solutions. This is your radio source for stories, the insight, and the answers you won't hear anywhere else. Not in the media and not coming from Springfield. You're listening to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Now, here's your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Good afternoon, Dan Proft, and on this edition of Illinois Rising, I'm joined by Jacob Hubert, who is a litigator with the Illinois Policy Institute's Liberty Justice Center. Jacob, thanks for joining us this week. Appreciate it.
Sure, happy to be here.
One of the fun things in the news this week in Chicagoland was this one-day strike that Chicago cab drivers lodged against free market economics. Well, specifically against Uber, but that's just a manifestation of free market economics. And it was to protest what they say is Uber getting to play by rules. Well, actually, Uber not having to play by the rules that they have to play by in terms of the purchase of a medallion and the other strictures with driving a cab in the city.
Yeah, right. They tried to hold a strike. It didn't seem to be very successful in as much as there were lots of taxis out there on the street. It was very easy to get one because most drivers would rather make money than participate in a futile political stunt. But it really is an attempted demonstration against the market and against consumers, against their customers, to try to deprive them of the option they've showed they preferred. These people apparently think that instead of just improving their services and competing, or maybe just switching to the Uber model that people like better, they'd rather take away, make life harder for their customers. And I'm not sure how they thought that was going to benefit them.
Yeah, this strikes me as a little bit like the fast food workers who kind of walk out on the job to do these protests for the $15 guaranteed wage, these sorts of stunts where it's not even those individuals that are protesting. They're really proxies for actually very wealthy interests. In the case of the fast food workers, public sector unions. In the case of taxi drivers, the wealthy people who actually own the medallions in aggregate and who are the people that are really upset and motivated because they see the basically market value of their medallion decreasing substantially with the advent of Uber and Lyft and these other ride-sharing services. But for more on this topic and the new sharing economy in which we live, we're joined by Scott Shackford. He is the associate editor at Reason.com. Scott, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So, you're watching Uber battle with cabbie unions around the country, not just here in Chicago. And what are one or two consistent themes that you see in these showdowns between Uber and big city governments and big city labor unions?
Sure. One of the big one is the argument being presented by cab drivers and cab companies, really, and those are two distinct things we should keep in mind, is that, they have to play by the rules, and we're playing by the rules. The Ubers and Lyfts and the ride-sharing companies, they aren't playing by the rules, ignoring, the idea that the rules were set up in the first place to favor the existing system. And, if that hadn't happened, it wouldn't have created the environment for these other ride-sharing services to develop a demand. So that's one of the big things. And, the other one is simply trying to protect what they have and stop the ride-sharing services entirely and protect restrictive policies that keep the number of taxis or the number of vehicles available for passengers to call to a limited number in order to protect the incomes of the drivers that exist.
Now, Scott, you touched on this briefly. This system that we have now where taxi drivers, their car has to have a medallion and all that, they say it's not fair that the ride-sharing companies don't have to do that too, but can you explain a little more about why it's kind of ridiculous for cab companies to complain about that?
Yeah, this is a system that the cab companies and cartels put into place to drive up the cost of being a cabbie, and control who can enter it, and kind of force cab drivers to be dependent on, taxi company employers in order to get into the system. So to get these these medallions can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it can take years to actually, pay for one. And so what happens is cabbies are essentially, as much as they complain that these ride-sharing services are being used and they're not really employees, a lot of cabbies are sort of hired guns for these, for the cartels, for the medallion owners to sort of pay for a medallion over time. They invested huge amounts of money. And this really drives people out of the cab business, keeps the number of people who are able to be taxi drivers limited, and therefore allows this marketplace that people have to pay way more than they should for taxis.
Well, and it's interesting, right, because that marketplace is changing. So now, for example, in San Francisco, where it used to take 10 years to get a medallion, now it takes 4 years to sell one. And so it's the owners of the medallions, but that are really, it's like seeing your home go underwater in terms of value back during the housing bubble. They don't like what's happening as the marketplace is changing. And so they're trying to protect their investments. It's understandable, but it's not consumer friendly. And the other interesting thing I find, one of the many interesting things about this discussion, is it turned out that the central planners in these big cities didn't actually properly calibrate the supply and demand. And you see that because some of the research that I've seen, you look at any major city, stick with San Francisco, for example, there are exponentially more Uber drivers than there are medallioned cab drivers. So those Uber drivers are not driving no one. They're obviously out there earning fares just like cab drivers are, indicating there was much bigger demand for these services than the authorities in San Francisco anticipated there was.
Yes, absolutely. And, we could be cynical about it and wonder if that's deliberate when the demand is high, that creates an incentive or the ability for the government and for the taxi drivers to really kind of control how much is charged for taxis, and lets them get away with higher prices. As the number, one of the things about the ride-sharing services, why it's so popular is because, number one, it is cheaper, and that is partly a market response. Because there's so much more availability, the prices come down.
Now, what about airports? I know in Chicago that's an issue right now. In fact, that's actually what these cabs drivers, I think the main thing they were arguing about in their strike was they're mad that Uber and other ride-sharing companies might now be allowed to pick people up at airports, which, of course, everybody wants because it's cheaper, because you often have to wait in line forever to get a cab at the airport. It'd be great if you could just have an Uber come legally. What's going on with that in other cities? Are other cities opening up their airports?
Yeah, it varies from city to city. I'm in Los Angeles, and they're talking about it here, and it looks like they're going to open it up here. Cab drivers complain about it. It's one of those situations where the system actually isn't very efficient for anybody, including the taxi drivers, because they have this incredibly, centrally planned system that often leaves taxi drivers having to wait forever to get fares, and for customers to also wait forever to get a cab, depending on the time of day. And so the system that exists is incredibly inefficient, but taxi drivers, because they have there's almost always a guaranteed minimum cost for picking up a fare at an airport. The huge wait for them, the annoyance of dealing with it is paid off with guaranteed money. And so they want to protect that guaranteed source, regardless of whether or not it's efficient for customers.
Well, one of the other interesting things about this to me is in terms of the arguments that are made, Uber drivers, the security with Uber drivers versus the licensed cab drivers. And we find that actually, if you look into it, despite the media focusing on transgressions by Uber drivers as compared to cab drivers, that the background checks for Uber drivers are more substantial in many cities than are required of cab drivers. In addition to that, liability insurance, because these are independent contractors, not employees. Well, at least the numbers I've seen, Uber requires $1 million liability insurance for their drivers, where in New York it's $100,000, $300,000. Chicago, it's $350,000. So it seems to me that Uber on the security side, on the safety side, on the insurance side is at least as stringent as the cab drivers, if not more so, or the cab companies, if not more so.
Well, Dan, if I could add, in Illinois and Chicago, you'll still hear the cab companies make this argument about, oh, well, they don't do the same background checks, they don't have the insurance. That's not an argument anymore. The state passed a law, the city passed a law, and as you say, Uber was already doing enough anyway. It's all covered. They can't even make that argument anymore. These people are all checked out. It's just, it's not a legitimate concern at all in this state, in this city.
And Scott, real quick before we let you go, how does this impact other sharing economy businesses, sectors now that have popped up? I'm thinking of like Airbnb. Are we going to have hotel companies or hotels, hotel owners coming to the government to try and protect them from Airbnb?
Oh, it happens already. Not just the rental. Realtors, the rental market is really concerned that it's taking money from them. From various people who benefit or gain from rental markets, hotels, because the cities themselves, and we're not even getting into the fact that governments make money off of taxation. So when people stay at Airbnb instead of staying at a hotel, what does that mean for tax revenue for that city? And so we are seeing their cities actually outright banning short-term apartment rentals, using Airbnb. And so that stuff goes around to other industries as well.
Scott Shackford, he's the associate editor at Reason.com. Thanks for checking in with us. We'll be following the story along with you again soon. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.